A huge patch just dropped. Let's take a look at what the top Infinite players are playing on day 1 of this new metagame. It would be pretty difficult to start anywhere but Fairishem. However, Fairishem is a little bit worse in my opinion than it was before the changes to Dr. Octopus and Leech. However, because this is an open metagame, people feel free to try stuff. That makes Fairishem a little bit better in context because people haven't really figured out that they need to be really trying to deal with this deck if they want to beat it. What I have here is called Fairishem. I got it from Derek, aka Havoc OP, the #1 ranked player on ladder at the moment. And it is a deck that is attempting to be good into other Fairishem decks by not having very good targets for the stuff that gets Loki'd out of your own deck. What that means is no blob. Because we are running Shadow King and Shang-Chi, if our opponent is Lokiing into that, they're going to be able to get that stuff. Many Fairishem decks are being running Shadow King and Shang-Chi right now, and we want to be as immune to that as we possibly can. The other thing that this deck is leveraging is just a massive amount of cube juicer cards. Cards that your opponent is not really looking to be able to play around. Cards like Claw, just hard stuff to deal with. When your opponent doesn't really have a good read on what's going on, that's when a deck like Fairishem is at its strongest. Similarly, in open metagames is when a deck like Fairishem is at its strongest. And because of the perception that we are entering a new metagame after this patch, Fairishem has been able to gain back a lot of the percentage points that it would otherwise be losing. Because people are playing things like Sandman. Nothing against Sandman, but if you're not running Cassandra Nova in your Sandman, you're going to get run over by Fairishem, and even if you are, you still might get run over by Fairishem. And that kind of gameplay, that kind of deck building decision is only possible in a world where people aren't particularly afraid of Fairishem. And because people aren't afraid of Fairishem, it is a great time to run it. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, new Loki in Fairishem. I am of the opinion that this is a legitimately, it's probably a little bit of a buff to Loki in this deck. This is now, I think, Loki's best home. I'll be talking about 2 other takes on Loki as a card itself and the confusion that it generates in terms of deck building a little bit later. But fundamentally, the #1 thing I want to convey to you right now is current Fairishem with current Loki is an incredibly potent combination. Playing that card on turn 2 is pretty absolutely ridiculous, and it makes Fairishem legitimately better into the sort of mid-range stuff that was traditionally its enemy. Meaning that mid-range stuff will need to utilize, Cassandra Nova, which creates a large amount of disparity between when you get Loki'd and when they actually play the Cassandra Nova. That is one of the major things that these decks are going to want to leverage. I think that this iteration of Fairishem Loki actually has a lot of the same incentives as trying to deck build against an old version of Loki, which is kind of interesting in that it does fill the role of Loki without being this all-consuming deck archetype. Right now, I would say Loki is probably the best card in this deck straight up, and a lot of the other stuff is very much up in the air. Loki is kind of a snap condition. It's the best card you have in the deck in the mirror. It's just a generally phenomenal card in what this deck is trying to do, which is simply run your opponent over by being ahead of curve and do strong stuff. Loki obviously helps with that a lot. I would consider this deck the sort of baseline for where Fairishem starts, and then we're going to start teching and adjusting to the metagame as needed. One thing you'll notice is the lack of blob. I talked with Derek about this, and the main reason he doesn't like blob in this deck right now is that it's not meaningfully all that much bigger than something like a Magneto. It doesn't have the same advantages as playing something like a Magneto. And I think this is crucial, it loses to Shadow King, which is very much on the upswing recently. Shadow King is going to be seeing a lot of play, in my experience, in these first few days of the metagame. And so having a card that is just this enormous beater that gets completely obliterated by Shadow King is not really a great spot to be in, unless you are utilizing it for other things. Since Darkhawk is on a relative downswing, as the move Thena decks have sort of forced it out of the metagame a little bit, Blob has lost a lot of its luster as a necessary anti-counter piece in Fairishem, and I think this is something to really consider. I'm not saying it's necessary that we cut Blob from Fairishem. You could totally talk me into putting Blob back in this deck. I would not necessarily be opposed, but he has gone from this is a core key piece of Fairishem to I think it might be a little bit more debatable. We started with Fairishem, now let's talk about what is good into Fairishem, and Cassandra Muva is very much that. Now, Fairishem does have these draws where they Loki you and play a lot of the stuff that you can play, but you are synergy-based enough that, like, with your Thena, with your Angela, with your Kitty, with your Cassandra, you should be able to create some meaningful disparity between what you can do and what your Fairishem Loki opponent can do. It's not always guaranteed, but it is sort of a similar dynamic to when they Loki'd you in the previous iteration of this deck. It's just now, you don't have to worry about all your stuff that happens on turn 6 getting obliterated by Leech, so you can actually count on Juggernaut a little bit more. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. You don't have to worry about your Shang-Chi getting Leech. You don't have to worry about all your stuff getting pulled by Doc Ock. You are able to reliably play out your game plan against Fairishem. So I do think this deck is a little bit better positioned in the metagame against Fairishem specifically than it was previously. But by the same token, because I think Fairishem is so good right now, I do think you don't have the luxury of cutting Cassandra Nova. And one thing that I actually would be interested to see is the main reason why I like the move iteration of the Thena deck as opposed to the Darkhawk iteration or the HazJax iteration or whatever you really want to put in there is because the move iteration of the Thena deck is the one that best balanced being good into other Thena decks and being good into Fairishem. If that equation has changed, if we need to value being good into Fairishem more, I can see a similar cycle to what happened a week ago happening, where the original Thena deck to really pop up beating Fairishem was a Darkhawk one, and then people started playing the move one because it beat the Darkhawk one while still beating Fairishem. That said, I do think I feel most confident on the move one. I think it's the one that has the best matchup spread into the widest variety of things. It is the safest, it is the easiest, it is the most straightforward baseline. If you want to play a non-Fairishem deck, you start here. And when I think about the metagame, I think of it going from Fairishem to this and then continuing on from there. Now, astute viewers will notice that that is the exact metagame cycle we kind of just left. We were in an Fairishem meta, then a Cassandra Nova Thena meta, and then we were moving towards Zoo. Now, I don't know how many people are actually aware of this, but most of my top high elo friends were playing some form of Zoo before the patch hit. And that is because this iteration of Zoo is quite good into Thena decks. It is able to leverage Shadow King powerfully in that matchup while not getting hurt by it in the same way. It has a lot of point spread across 3 lanes. And I think this is also pretty crucial. It's very good against Juggernaut when you fill up every lane. Those Thena decks, especially the move ones, are reliant a lot on targeting 2 lanes. They do 2 lane stuff, Juggernaut wins one, Captain Marvel wins one, maybe we scam a lane with something else. Like, they're not really spreading across 3 lanes. And so if you are able to contest them meaningfully, you can do some powerful things in the context of being a Zoo deck that just has a bunch of points and has a relevant Shadow King that's going to play as like a 2/8 most of the time you play it, because you're hitting like an Angela, or you're hitting a Gwen-pooled card, or you're hitting a Thena, or you're hitting whatever, right? Like, there's a lot that this deck can do to leverage Shadow King that doesn't hurt it. It's a powerful, powerful deck, and I think one other point in favor of Zoo is, in my opinion, the biggest counters to Zoo previously were either Silver Surfer, thanks to being a good Killmonger deck, or the deck Loki. And I personally, of those decks, preferred Loki. Loki was the thing that I was the most afraid to see when I was a Zoo deck, because if someone played Loki against me, they would just play my whole deck, and that would be kind of it, right? Being able to Loki a Zoo deck was the best counter that I could actually find, and that card is gone now. And so I think when we talk about a potential metagame cycle, I can very easily envision it being Fairishem to Thena to Zoo, because that's what actually just happened in the last 2 weeks. Like, in the last 10 days even, since Cassandra Nova came out, we saw the metagame cycle Fairishem to Thena to Zoo. At the very, very top, that was the transition that was actually happening. And I think it's very possible that we end up in a similar spot now, because Fairishem, I believe, is a little bit underrated. People are going to start playing it more, then people are going to be trying to counter it, and then people are going to be trying to counter that. I have wanted to find the space in my YouTube schedule to do a Sandman highlight, because I think for the past week, Sandman has been a legitimately competitive deck, a good deck, and there are like 3 different builds that you can plausibly play. There's this one you see on screen. There's the build with Leader at the top end and Doctor Doom at the top end. And then there is also the build that is using Patriot and Ultron and Doom and Absorbing Man and Brood and things of that nature. All of these builds are targeting the same thing, which is the Thena decks and the Zoo decks. They're not very good into Fairishem. Even with Cassandra Nova, it is a little bit of an uphill battle because the fundamental thing that you are trying to accomplish is something that Fairishem does a little better than you. However, if you are looking to beat up on Cassandra Nova and Zoo, I think this is a very, very astute choice to make. One of the interesting things about this deck is it is a deck that did have a pretty poor matchup into the old version of Loki, because Loki would typically just get your 6-drops and then play them, and then your Sandman really wasn't doing anything. Now, the new version of Loki, I think, can do that, but a little bit less consistently, and I'm interested to see what that actually means. Because Sandman, to me, is a deck that needs to be respected, whatever build of it you actually have. There's this one, there's the Patriot one, courtesy of Zombies Go Nom Nom, and of course, the one that I had on my tier list on, that was on Sunday, right? I should know that, right? I should definitely know that. That was on Sunday. And I think basically all of them are in a fairly similar position. The one that I think is the most played is the Patriot one, but I really like this one in the context of just being a deck full of reasonably good and strong cards that has the ability to slam a Sandman down a little bit unpredictably. I think most people at this point, when they see the Patriot stuff, are expecting the Sandman, or at least are aware that it is a potentially possible thing. So I like to try to catch people off guard with Sandman. And I think that's really, really important, because in order for this deck to have reasonable cube equity, they can't really be expecting the Sandman. Decks like Bounce and Thena, you might think Sandman auto wins against them, but if they know you have a Sandman, it can get a little hairy because they can actually just output a ton of points. Now, the Fairishem matchup is a hindrance, despite the fact that we have Cassandra Nova. One of the main upsides of being the Patriot version of this, actually, is that you get to run Cassandra Nova and you get to run Absorbing Man, so you can just, like, maybe sometimes make 2 giant Cassandra Novas, and that'll carry you against Fairishem. I'm not sure that's worth doing, but it is something that is absolutely worth noting. However, I think this build is a more balanced, reasonable, and a little bit surprising build. And I think there is really something to be said for that when you are playing a card like Sandman that, when foreseen, can be very, very awkward. Right here on my shirt, you can see it says Simplicity, and Silver Surfer is the ultimate in simplicity. This deck is extremely straightforward and extremely easy to understand what it is trying to do. It's a deck that gets to run Cassandra Nova and Absorbing Man in a world where people are still playing Fairishem. In a world where people are playing Sandman, it gets to get out ahead on tempo. In a world where people are playing Thena decks, well, it can at least try to compete on points. That's a reasonable attempt that it actually has to make. And so I think Silver Surfer ends up being put in a situation in this metagame where it is generally pretty okay. It's a balanced, reasonable deck that has a lot of good options into a lot of commonly played things. If you're looking for something that might be a good angle to attack the metagame from, Silver Surfer actually probably can support that thing. You have Killmonger into the Zoo decks. You have Cassandra Nova into the Fairishem decks. There are real arguments for why this deck makes a lot of sense right now. And I think that that is the main sort of determinant of whether Silver Surfer is good in any given metagame is, are there things that it is meaningfully hitting with its non-brood 3-drops, right? So when you look at these decks, there are like a couple slots for non-brood 3-drops. And those slots are a little bit hard to actually figure out a lot of the time. You have options like Mobius or Red Guardian or Killmonger. And Surfer is at its best when it's running multiple of those and they're hitting relevant things. Right now, I'm not sure Red Guardian and Mobius are hitting anything. If you think they are, feel free to put them in and get them in for a Makari. That makes perfect sense to me. That would be a mark in this deck's favor. I think it's a little bit too early in the metagame for me to feel confident in running tech cards like that. However, I'm always very confident in running Killmonger, even when the metagame isn't calling for it, and it kind of is calling for it right now. And Cassandra Nova, obviously, is an absurdly strong tech card in a world where people are playing Fairishem, and I started out this video talking about that deck. So, Surfer to me is a deck that has always been defined by how good the other stuff at 3 is in the context of the metagame. The rest of the deck is fairly static. Your Hope Summerses, your Broods, your Surfers, your Absorbing Mans, that's all static, right? That doesn't change. What changes is how good the other stuff at 3 is at dealing with what people are doing right now. And I think the other stuff at 3 is actually pretty good right now. TLSG posted this update on the HazJax deck that I have been championing for a while, the Hazmat Bounce Ajax deck that I personally particularly enjoy. I think this is an interesting direction to take the deck. I'm not perfectly sold on the Grandmaster, but I do like that there's a bit of a lean into the clog portion of this deck by including the new Dr. Octopus in it, who I think is a reasonable inclusion in a deck that is already playing things like Hood Viper and, you know, things like White Widow. The issue is Grandmaster to me seems like perhaps a bridge too far. I'm posting TLSG's original list here, but if I were to play this, my instinct is I think I would try for a non-Grandmaster kind of card in that spot. I get what's going on here. I understand what the card Grandmaster does. I get it. You can double up on White Widow. You can double up on your Hood. There are really cool things that this card can do, and I think there's like some slick stuff this enables. However, I am a little bit worried when I look at this deck for lack of baseline power. I do think that you end up probably wanting maybe a Shadow King, maybe a Shang-Chi, something that can deal with big things that are coming your way. I'm not positive, but it does occur to me as something that might be relevant instead of just doubling down on being a Grandmaster deck. I really like that this is importing the Clog package even more. I think this is like a deck that can meaningfully have a Clog sub-theme in it and have it be good. But I am a little bit struck by, okay, maybe we need to get Falcon back in here. Maybe we need a tech piece. Maybe we need something else. Because it's less a bounce deck and more a mid-range deck that has this stuff in it. And I do think that without the ability to go incredibly tall, as most bounce decks have, we end up a little bit more reliant on Clog stuff and HazJax stuff. And basically what I'm getting at here is I think there's room for customization, and we can see where this archetype goes. Because I've always been a fan of this archetype. I have enjoyed playing decks like this since HazJax dropped. I did a video on it, calling it one of the best decks in the game. I'm a big fan of it. I think there's a lot of potential here, but I think we're going to have to figure out where this deck fits in the metagame. Because of all the decks I've talked about so far, this is the one that I'm least certain about its space in the metagame. What you might have noticed if you've been watching this video the whole way through is I'm very sure, or I seem very sure, I'm fairly confident in the space in the metagame of the earlier decks we were talking about. Fairishem is you must be this tall to ride Predator. Thena decks with Cassandra beat Fairishem. Zoo decks are pretty good into Thena decks. Surfer is pretty good into Zoo and has a reasonable game into Fairishem. You see where I'm going with this. I'm the least certain about this. And I think that is a real kind of, like, where does this fit in issue that I'd like to figure out in the future. I think there's power and potential here for sure, but I'd like to see a little bit more, like, I'd like to just know for sure what my matchup spread is. I'd like to know how I feel into all of these decks, and I'd like to feel like I'm confident into the rest of them. One thing that I have noticed is, like, I really am not sure about not having Cassandra Nova in here. I don't know, because without Cassandra Nova and without Shang-Chi, I end up looking at this and thinking, I'm not sure we have enough power to beat Fairishem. I think we have to clog them if we want to beat them. And I think having Cassandra Nova and Shang-Chi, it might not be as sexy as having Grandmaster and Dr. Octopus, but it might be a little bit better. Anyhow, I do like the Doc Ock. I just want to make sure we actually have game into the stuff I'm expecting to see. So let's talk about dedicated Loki lists. I've got 2 here that I played yesterday. One is from Coco Bird. That's the first one we're going to be talking about. And the second one is from Derek. Now, Coco Bird's list is, I think, a very unique and weird and fun take on Loki that really leans into what Loki is now. And what Loki is now is a card that wants you to have a lot of good stuff already in your hand, a lot of weird and powerful and stuff, things your opponent isn't going to play around, like your tech or an Iron Man or whatever, and then it'll take care of the rest by drawing you cheaper stuff from your opponent's deck. That's sort of how I look at it right now. And that is evident in how these decks are being built, because they look like piles. These are just like piles of cards, right? But they're piles of good cards, and Loki is there to make up the gap in them. The interesting thing is, you almost don't want your Loki deck to be too focused right now. This dynamic could change. But right now, if you have a focused, like, Thena Kitty deck, I feel like you'd rather just be playing the deck that you made than Loki, unless you are playing against other Thena Kitty decks. You remember how I said the previous metagame cycle was Fairishem into Thena Kitty into Zoo? It's entirely possible that this one takes a hard left turn, and we end up with something like Fairishem into Thena Kitty into Thena Loki, because Loki is really good in Thena mirrors. Now, right now, I'm not sure there's enough Thena mirrors to justify being a Thena Loki deck, but in a world where there are, that would be justifiable. For now, a lot of the Loki decks look like this. They're just like weird piles of cards that are doing strong things on their own, and then what you're doing Loki here is just like, I'm going to draw some more weird and strong cards, and I'm just going to play a bunch of good cards, and effectively turn my good cards deck into a good cards plus deck, because I'm getting your cards too. The interesting thing is the skill check on Loki is still there. There's a lot of decks where you honestly don't want to play Loki. If your opponent's playing Mr. Negative, you kind of don't want to play it. If your opponent is playing cards like Phoenix Force, you definitely don't want to play it. If your opponent's playing Destroy, it's a little bit more contextual. This also makes Nico much better with Loki, because Nico drawing 2 cards is now drawing 2 Loki'd cards, which is kind of crazy. There's a lot of interesting things happening in this space right now. Ultimately, I would consider this stuff a bit too unfocused to be truly tier 1, but it does feel like there's maybe some potential here. This is Derek's build of Loki, and what you'll notice is it's following a lot of the same principles. We're just running some good cube juicer cards, and then the goal here is we'll have a pretty decent hand, we'll play a 3-5 that gets our deck good, and then you just, go from there. There's a lot of freestyling in this current build of Loki. However you end up putting it together, Loki ends up looking like a pile. And I think that's part of why it's so good in Fairishem decks, which are kind of definitionally a pile. But however you really slap this together, it's sort of doing the same good cards plus Loki shtick. But it doesn't want to be so focused like a Thena deck would be on specific good cards and specific interactions. So instead of playing any of the cards that dictate how you play the rest of the game, like Thena, we end up playing just, stuff. You pick 11, I should say, good cards, and you put them in your deck, and then you put Loki in your deck, and that's kind of the entire thing. And I think there's a reasonable way in which people can look at this and say, that's terrible deck building. I actually find this kind of fascinating, I'm not gonna lie to you. After so long of Loki being this one thing, which is just cards that fill up your hand, and then you play Loki, and then you crush mid-range, it's now a totally different thing with a lot of the same dynamics. And I think, we'll have to obviously see. But this is scratching my brain in a way I really didn't expect it to. I don't think this stuff is going to end up all that amazing, but there is a real chance that it does. And that is a really fascinating puzzle to put in front of a person like me, who was so dedicated to the previous iteration of Loki. So I guess what I have to say is, R.I.P. Loki, long live Loki. That's really where I'm at right now. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. I have been KM Best. I know you're probably, if you're skipping to this part in the video, what you want to know is which of these decks I would play right now. Fairishem and Thena Move are number 1 and number 2 for a reason. Sandman is uniquely well-positioned. Zoo is fairly well-positioned right now as well. Surfer, I kind of like into those other ones. And then as we get towards the back 3, I think they're a little bit more experimental, but I'm interested to see what they end up developing into. Personally, I think the Fairishem decks, until people remember that they need to be Cassandra Nova-ing in profitable ways, might be the way to go, but I tend to try to stay a step ahead. I will tell you, I didn't lose a single game with the Cassandra Muva deck. I feel like that deck is it's just exactly what you want from a deck right now. So that might be my number 1 choice, but I do think there are some real options out there. And personally, if I had to pick a dark horse, I'm excited for the future of Silver Surfer. I know that might seem weird, but I am. It's very easy to talk me into a deck that has a relevant Killmonger and also gets to Cassandra Nova and Absorbing Man the Cassandra Nova. Very easy to talk me into something like that. I am going to be interested to see how things shape up, because while that is a good move, there's also a lot more Shadow King in the meta, so maybe not. As always, I've been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. Let me know how you liked this video. I really spent a lot of time on it, talking to my friends and playing these decks and doing all that stuff and just trying to get a good deck roundup for y'all on day one. So I hope you enjoy. I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.